projector starts, and so begins this episode of Movie Nights and Matinees, the podcast for people who enjoy movies from when we actually had to go to the movies. I'm your host, Bill Groves, and this is episode 10, Summer of '82, in which my guest and I will be one and the same. For reasons I'll explain shortly, I'll be covering material that's a little more contemporary than that of past episodes, and fully autobiographical, telling you about how I spent my summer not on vacation in my hometown of Tulsa back in 1982. Make yourself comfortable and sit back for an episode that, among its other unique qualities, won't be one of the longer ones.
How about a short one? How about a short one?
If you're going to lead people, you have to have somewhere to go.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for listening. I don't know if it's because of summer and vacation plans and so forth, but for some reason, my attempts to schedule a guest for this episode kind of crashed and burned. I do have several guests lined up, but the specific timing isn't something etched in stone or nailed down a long time in advance. Anyhow, due to some conflicts and in one case a sinus infection, I found myself approaching this one with no guest available. Especially since there was already a speed bump in the schedule resulting from my recent vacation, I didn't want to go another 3 weeks in between episodes, so I thought of some options for flying solo. I regularly ask my guests for their most memorable movie-going experience, and I've also shared my own. What I decided to do here is share my most memorable movie-making experience. Yeah, as if there's a lot to choose from. And revive for you a set of 41-year-old recollections from when I actually did work as a crew member on a major motion picture. With any luck, you'll find these memories interesting, perhaps amusing, and if not, at least won't hold it against me. First, let me give you some background. Okay, maybe not that much background. Anyhow, I had aspired to be a filmmaker since high school when I took 3 semesters of the filmmaking class that was offered, which no one had done before. One of the films I made during that time, a sort of visual essay on the 1976 Tulsa State Fair, won a prize in a Young Filmmakers Festival sponsored by the Tulsa Library. In college, as part of my pursuit of a degree in theater, I took a playwriting course, and for the final project, I was allowed to submit a screenplay entitled A Comeback of Sorts, which was kind of a blend of psychological thriller and horror. It received an A, and as for what became of it later...
I'll sort of skip over that part if you don't mind.
I wish you would.
Right.
Anyhow, fresh out of college in 1981, I tried to get a job on the Disney production of Tex, which was filming locally, but I had no success. My college friend Phil Brock, however, with whom I'd appeared in Oliver during my senior year, managed to land a supporting role in the film.
Great, man. This is fantastic. What am I gonna do? Man, I gotta get you to a hospital. They're gonna ask all kind of questions. You're gonna call the cops. What if they want to look in the car, man? I got stuff in the trunk.
Still hoping for a Hollywood break by way of writing at some point, I went to work for an antenna-based subscription TV service. A new UHF station had debuted not long before, and the subscription service would take over the channel in the evenings, with programming similar to HBO, featuring uncut movies and occasionally pay-per-view events such as boxing matches. It was a viable service given that there were plenty of rural areas in the market that weren't part of the cable TV infrastructure. Now, I was in sales, but in 1981, I had ended up actually doing an installation for a gentleman named John Rutchland, who was in town serving as construction coordinator for Francis Ford Coppola's production of The Outsiders, which would be filming in Tulsa.
The Outsiders. S.E. Hinton's classic novel comes to the screen, capturing all the intensity, all the excitement, all the emotions of youth. The Outsiders, directed by Francis Coppola.
John was renting an apartment in a high-rise building that evidently hadn't yet added cable to its amenities. In fact, if you watch Tex, you'll actually see that apartment building in the film. In the story, it's where some drug dealers live, and my friend Phil Brock and Matt Dillon go there to have a little conversation with them. Anyhow, seeing a potential opportunity, I mentioned to John that I had been trying to get some sort of job with the production of The Outsiders, and he was nice enough to invite me to visit him at the production offices, which were housed in a closed elementary school. He gave me a tour of the offices, but no offer of any sort of job materialized. In early 1982, I took a vacation and made my first trip to the Los Angeles area. I actually stayed at a motel in Hollywood itself on Sunset Boulevard, apparently right where the hookers gathered for their nightly negotiations regarding corner rights, loudly and all night long. In addition to seeing a production of the Marx Brothers-infused musical comedy, A Day in Hollywood, A Night in the Ukraine, I also visited Disneyland, Universal Studios, and I took the tour of the Burbank Studios, which at the time was shared by Warner Brothers and Columbia Pictures. Now it's strictly Warner Brothers. The tour was much less formal then than it is now, and it was just me and a couple being shown around on a small golf cart. At the end of the tour, I purchased a Warner Brothers logo t-shirt. Now, it wasn't the classic Shield logo that eventually returned to prominence, but this is that one that I think came along in the 70s, kind of a square with rounded corners, and I don't know what you would call it exactly, sort of a pop art stylized type of W in the center. You probably know the one I'm talking about. One stop that I made during that trip was kind of a mashup of my interest in a career in films by way of writing and the interest I had as a collector of comics, specifically Marvel comics, over the years. In an act consisting of 1 part boldness, 2 parts naivete, I paid a visit to the offices of Marvel Productions on Van Nuys Boulevard, which at the time was only involved in Saturday morning cartoon projects, and I left with them a copy of a treatment for an Iron Man movie that I'd written. In response, I received a nice form letter thanking me for it, but not being so discourteous as to tell me that it was unlikely to ever be read or even find a permanent home in a file cabinet. But who knows? Maybe it sits in a box somewhere in a Disney storage facility at this point. Also during that trip, I visited the campus of UCLA, where a friend and former coworker was enrolled in their film school. I had aspirations to do the same and spent some time gathering information regarding the application process. Fast forward a few months, I'd landed a job at a restaurant of the type where the waitstaff dress up as characters. I'm confident that I was the best Groucho they ever had because I devoted myself to doing it with as much accuracy as possible, including the costume elements. I had a few standard lines I liked to use. For instance, when a man would come in with an attractive date, I would say, "I don't suppose there's any chance she's your sister," and of course follow that with the eyebrows. Now, if a woman came in accompanied by 2 men, it would be, "So, which one of you boys couldn't get a date, or is she just ambidextrous?" One evening, a guy came in who informed me that he was going to be working as location manager for Rumblefish, the Coppola production following on the heels of The Outsiders, also to be shot in Tulsa. This man was Paul Tompkins, who I learned was a fellow Oklahoman, a native of Oklahoma City. I don't remember how I communicated it without breaking character, or maybe I didn't, but somehow, I let him know that I'd tried to get a job on The Outsiders and failed. Long story short, largely because I don't remember the precise detailed chronology, Paul was able to get me hired on as his assistant. So I became, in effect, assistant location manager, although my screen credit is merely one of several production aides. So I took a hiatus from my restaurant job and prepared for a summer of movie production. Now, Paul informed me that the type of job I'd be doing was one that would normally be handled by a member of a union, and that if any union members objected, he'd have to let me go. Thankfully, that never happened, and the primary union guys that I was to become acquainted with during the production were nothing but nice to me. Now, I had never read any of S.E. Hinton's novels. I remembered her first 2, The Outsiders and That Was Then, This Is Now, being prominently displayed in my junior high's library, and I know they were popular, but they didn't hold any interest for me. I was either reading the library's offerings of science fiction, such as Planet of the Apes or John Christopher's Tripods trilogy, or else books on early cinema by Frank Menchel. However, now that I was going to play a small part in bringing Rumblefish to the screen, I thought I should gain a sense of what it was going to be, so I bought a paperback copy of the book and quickly read it. I was actually very impressed with the story and Susie's characters, and she later signed the book for me. The first day's shooting was going to be on a Monday, and I believe it was the Friday prior that there was a big production gathering that took place in the Tulsa Performing Arts Center. Now, the Performing Arts Center has several theater spaces. There's the huge proscenium theater where the major concerts and stage productions are presented. There's a smaller proscenium theater that's more for community theater type things, and I actually appeared in a show in that theater at one point. And then there are a couple of studio type theater spaces, which are essentially just big empty rooms where any shape of performance space can be set up with movable bleachers for seating. Now, in this instance, for this production meeting, the plan was to show the crew videotaped rehearsals that formed kind of a very rough cut of what the movie would be like. So I arrived in the theater space for this meeting, and I saw 3 long tables forming a U configuration set in front of a big projection screen. Now, behind this big U were 6 sofas arranged into 3 rows of 2. And then at the back of the room, just to the left of the door as you entered, was another set of long tables, 2 or 3, I guess, on which food was available. And various personnel were assembling plates of edibles for themselves. I, however, bearing in mind Paul's caution regarding being dismissed from the crew if anyone objected, I was determined to make myself as inconspicuous as possible. So I refrained from helping myself to the food and planted myself on the right rear sofa at the end farthest away from the food, and I just casually observed. Now, at some point, Francis arrived. Francis Ford Coppola, director of The Godfather, Apocalypse Now, The Conversation, which I'd seen in a college film class, and Finian's Rainbow. Immediately, all eyes in the room were upon him, following him as he selected a plate and began filling it with food. Once that process was complete, he departed the vicinity of the buffet and, with all eyes continuing to follow him, found himself a seat right next to me. Well, okay, that's a bit of an exaggeration. It was a long sofa. I guess there were 3 cushions. I was at one end. He was at the other. There was a cushion in between. And at that moment, I had no greater wish than just to be able to disappear under that cushion like so much loose change, having seen my attempt to be inconspicuous evaporate. Now, looking back, I don't know that Francis would have given it any thought, but I thought it might be rude of me to sit there without acknowledging his presence, so I awkwardly introduced myself. Beyond that, I have no memory of anything he might have said in response. Later on, I would find myself in limited conversations with him. Now, the anecdotes I have from Rumblefish don't generally have that much to do with my role as assistant location manager, nor do they necessarily flow in any kind of order, much like the manner in which a film is edited together after a good deal of out-of-sequence shooting. However, I do recall that Rumblefish was shot roughly in the sequence of the story. The first scene filmed, for instance, was the one that opens the picture in Benny's pool hall.
You're Rusty James. Biff Wilcox looking for you, Rusty James.
I'm not hiding.
He says he's gonna kill you, Rusty James.
I suppose I may as well begin by talking about the various cast members with whom I became acquainted to one degree or another. As a comic collector at the time, I was able to have comic-related conversations with fellow collectors Lawrence Fishburne and Nicolas Cage, who I knew at the time as Nick Coppola, since nothing of his had yet been released with the name Cage. And he is Francis's nephew.
You know, you set up a fight and you recruit half the neighborhood, and now I guess you got plans of your own, huh?
Yup. Take a walk, Smoke.
If Biff's there and you don't show up, you know what's gonna happen to the rest of us?
What?
You think he's gonna believe we went there to watch?
I actually let Larry Fishburne, borrow my car once to drive to a convenience store up the road so he could buy some comics. Now, as for Nick, at one point I asked him if there was a superhero he'd like to play, and he told me the Submariner. Of course, he went on to play Ghost Rider, and Namor, the Submariner, didn't show up on movie screens until Wakanda Forever with a modified origin. Another cast member with whom I shared an interest was Vincent Spano, who played Steve in the film.
What if the motorcycle boy came back and found out?
What?
I said, what if your brother came back and found out?
Like me, he was keen on making Super 8 films. One of the nights during which the street carnival scene was being shot, I brought my top-of-the-line Super 8 sound camera to the set to show Vince, and I ended up shooting a 50-foot reel of behind-the-scenes footage. In one of our conversations, he told me of his casting in the upcoming Black Stallion Returns. He told me that he hadn't managed to get a copy of the book yet, so I visited a local used bookstore and picked one up for him. Another memory I have of Vince, which was also during the nights we were shooting the street carnival sequence, I saw him and he was with a young lady who he introduced to me as his cousin. Well, I didn't know any better, but eventually I realized that this was in fact Heather Langenkamp, a native Tulsan who had, from what I understand, done some extra work on The Outsiders and then again in Rumblefish, although I hadn't met her during that time. And she would go on a couple of years later to star in Nightmare on Elm Street. Now, as far as I know, she is not, in fact, Vince Spano's cousin. I think he was just pulling my leg, but, I haven't done that much research into the family tree there, so who knows? I don't recall quite how I came into Mickey Rourke's orbit during the production, although at some point I know I told him that I liked his performance in Body Heat. Well, somewhere along the line, he asked me to run lines with him for a scene taking place in a pet shop where the brothers are looking at the Rumblefish, as they were called. I read Matt Dillon's lines for him.
Now, what are you doing following me around like a lost puppy? What do you want out of me anyway?
What do you want? You want money? I can get you some money. Let's just get out of here.
I don't need any money, man. What do you want? Really? Tell me.
I want you to see me when you look at me. I want you to talk to me without dragging on about the Greek. You and the old man, you think I'm dumb, right? You think I'm a dummy because I don't know the big words, right? Always leave me out. Well, I ain't that dumb.
I actually served as Mickey's stand-in for one shot setup. His usual stand-in was actually the bartender at the restaurant where I'd been working, and for some reason he was out that morning. The scene takes place under the river bridge, and it follows the mugging scene, which I'll talk about more a little later. Mickey was to be positioned sitting on top of a big dumpster, although in the final composition you don't see what he's sitting on. But in any case, as framed, the angle is kind of semi-profile with Mickey's the side of his face and his shoulder in the foreground, and then he's looking down at Vince Spano and Matt Dillon, who are on the ground.
You and your gangs. It wasn't anything you think it was. A bunch of punks killing each other.
Hey, Steve, you don't know nothing.
Don't tell me I don't know nothing.
You don't know nothing
You
about
tell
it.
him. You tell him.
It wasn't anything.
You see?
What?
You see? Did you hear him?
So it was just that one kind of more or less over-the-shoulder shot that I stood in for Mickey. Now, at one point during the production, and this may have been while I was running lines with him, Mickey borrowed the radio handset that I was required to carry and amused himself by making prank calls to our second AD, a fellow named Mark Radcliffe, a Tulsa native. Incidentally, in November of 2000, when I took a trip to the UK, Mark was serving as executive producer on the first Harry Potter film, and he was kind enough to allow me to visit the set at Leavesden and watch some of the filming. Of course, it also helped that I was working for Warner Brothers at the time. As for Matt Dillon, again, I don't recall the specifics of how I happened to be in his vicinity at any given time, but one night he did offer me an extra McDonald's quarter pounder that had been picked up for him that he didn't want. I guess they brought him two, and he ate one. That was enough. He let me have the other one. Of course, Matt was kind of the established teen idol at that point of the cast, so there was never a shortage of young girls hanging around the location hoping for a glimpse of him or maybe an autograph. I think to some he came off as snobbish, but observing him at close quarters, I think it was really just kind of a shyness. I mean, he started making movies at an age when social skills are in an important stage of development, and I had the impression that the process for him had been kind of short-circuited, resulting in a discomfort that could come across in a negative way when that wasn't his attitude at all. I didn't have much interaction with Diane Lane, though during one night of shooting, I shared a lunch table with her. It was considered lunch due to it falling in the middle of the production day, regardless of the hour. Anyway, I remember asking her how she liked Tulsa, and her response being not especially enthusiastic. Of course, it was probably an unfair question, since Between her time on The Outsiders and now Rumblefish, what she was primarily seeing of the city was not exactly the crown jewels that are available for people to visit. Now, veteran actor William Smith, who played the cop, was someone I enjoyed talking to.
Why'd he come back?
He lives here, man. You know, you live somewhere, he lives somewhere.
Well, he knew better than to come back.
Hey, this is his home, man. Know what I mean?
Motorcycle boy.
The motorcycle boy. The motorcycle.
You think you know about him, huh?
At one point, I asked him about having worked with director Richard Donner. He told me that Donner was the best actors director he'd ever worked with. Of course, he'd go on to work with Donner again during the big poker tournament scene in the movie Maverick, which featured a lot of stars of past TV westerns, little cameos, and he was one of them. I'd stayed in touch with Bill since Rumblefish, and when that production came to the Warner Brothers lot, I made a point of visiting him during my lunch hours, and he invited me onto the soundstage to watch some of that scene being filmed. I'd hoped to get an introduction to Donner, but it didn't happen. Nevertheless, I was able to do a phone interview with Richard Donner a few years later. Ironically, Bill Smith and Richard Donner died the same day in 2021. My conversations with Coppola himself came about sporadically, and as I wasn't keeping a journal, I can't really provide any meaningful context. I don't remember being an active participant in the conversation when he talked about the contrast between all the personnel and equipment required to make Rumblefish as opposed to making The Rain People, where pretty much everything was transported in a station wagon. So he said, at least that's what I recall him saying. During another conversation, he commented that he would like to make a movie of Lee Falk's famous comic strip character, the Phantom, which was later adapted by director Simon Windsor, starring Billy Zane. Now, we did have a substantial conversation when he mentioned that he'd been commissioned to write a James Bond script for producer Kevin McClory, and was in the process of developing it. Now, at the time, and for a good while after that, I assumed that this was for the project that eventually was released as Never Say Never Again. But since that was released in 1983, it would have had to have already been well into at least pre-production during that time, so it may have been that McClory anticipated enough box office success for his first Bond picture to merit plans for a follow-up, and then possibly that's what Coppola had been commissioned to write. Anyway, Francis told me that he was titling his script Domino, which would make sense as McClory's James Bond rights were limited to the characters and elements of Thunderball, of which Never Say Never Again was a remake. Domino was the female lead character, played by Kim Basinger. Anyhow, I ended up loaning Coppola my collection of James Bond books, which included a reference book on the character, for him to use as research while working on the script. Obviously, nothing came of it, as there was no sequel produced to Never Say Never Again. As an aside, Francis's daughter Sophia, who has since become a director herself, had roles in The Outsiders and Rumblefish. She was credited on screen under the name Domino. My assumption is that, aware of her dad's James Bond script project, she liked the name and decided to make it her screen name. Over the course of the production, there are several noteworthy things that stand out in my memory, one of which only became humorous in the retelling. There's a scene where Matt Dillon meets Diane Lane as she's getting off the bus coming home from school. They have an argument as they walk down this curving street.
What's the matter? What are you so upset about?
All right. I heard all about your little party.
What?
Up at the lake?
So what?
Marcia Kirk was there. She told me all about it.
Now, the location for this was in front of a row of houses that faced a large, undeveloped field adjacent to a near downtown freeway interchange. As the shot was originally planned, the houses would serve as background for the long tracking shot used to capture the scene. Consequently, when the production trucks arrived, they parked along the curb opposite the houses, where they would all be either behind the camera or off to the side out of shot during the tracking shot. However, when Francis arrived, he decided that he wanted to flip the shot and have the large field in the background with some burning tires to create some atmosphere, which required a quick phone call to the fire department for notification and permission. So suddenly we had a bunch of production trucks and no place for them. The shot was going to capture some of the homes, so the trucks couldn't be moved to that side of the street. Now, at the end of the street was a bank's drive-through facility. So with no small amount of skill, the trucks were moved into that drive-through area, leaving just enough room for cars to maneuver through and conduct their business. A call was made to the bank management, and they were understanding and cooperative. The scene was shot, and the bank's customers were served. Some white smoke was deployed at that far end of the street, by the way, which helped to mask that whole area, including the bank drive-through. Don't know that you would have really seen much of anything, but even the driveway, you really don't see because of that white smoke. Once the scene was completed, it was time to move to the next location and setup. My job had me essentially being the last to leave. One by one, the production trucks were loaded up and they drove off. The last one was the prop truck. The driver started it, put it in gear, and pulled out of the bank drive-through lot. It almost cleared the phone lines. But it didn't, and suddenly the bank lost phone service. Now, while this wasn't as catastrophic then as it would be nowadays, with online banking being the norm, it was obviously still a significant disruption for them. I wasn't involved in resolving the problem, but I assume that Paul, my boss on the picture, was. The shooting days for the picture, or nights as the case may be, were I think usually around 11 hours. A major exception came on Labor Day, when we were originally scheduled to be off. Prior to the argument scene I talked about before, there was a scene where Diane Lane's character is among a horde of girls leaving their Catholic school at the end of the school day and getting on buses. Well, apparently something went wrong at the lab, and the footage of that scene was rendered unusable, so it needed to be reshot. Well, Labor Day was the last chance to reshoot that scene, as the following day, both the school and the girls would be back in normal operation. And since we ended up working that day anyway, it was decided to add a couple more location setups to the schedule, including a cemetery scene that was ultimately excluded from the final film. That workday ended up running 23 and a half hours. Now, the cemetery scene I just mentioned was to have been one of a series of sequences strung together as part of a near-death vision that Matt Dillon's character, Rusty James, has after getting violently mugged in an alley. The filming of the mugging scene created a couple of fond memories for me. It was filmed in a downtown alley about half a block from an area where some years prior an intersection had been closed and a plaza constructed called Bartlett Square, named after former Oklahoma Governor Dewey Bartlett. Central to it was a group of large slabs in a kind of an unusual configuration at different heights and angles and things like that, and a large fountain in the center. It provided a nice area for downtown workers to congregate, shop, and eat lunch. One especially large slab, I think it was situated right above the fountain, often served as a stage for musical performers, and there would be a lot of activity during downtown events such as Mayfest or the Chilean Bluegrass Festival, that sort of thing. As with any movie production, filming in a community where such activity is something out of the ordinary, and especially when popular actors are involved, crowds tend to gather to watch the filming to the extent possible. I mentioned earlier the young girls who wanted to see Matt Dillon, but more generally, just people like to come check it out. The fact that there's a movie being made in town. Let's see what we can see. In this case, now the mugging scene, took place in an alley that wasn't where any such interested parties could see anything. The most they could see would be the production vehicles parked outside of the alley, along with crew members coming and going. Rarely would there be any chance to see any of the actors. Now, Francis had a camera system that, while no doubt very common today, probably wasn't at the time, which was that it had a simultaneous video feed hooked up to the 35mm film camera rig so that he could see what the camera was seeing on a small monitor. He could also do a video playback that would help him decide whether to do another take. It was a wireless system operating on a UHF frequency so that if there was a TV nearby, you could actually tune in and see what Francis and the camera were seeing. Now, Francis had a personal Zoetrope Productions RV that he used, and it was parked near the alley. It was equipped with an assortment of video equipment, including a VCR well before most people had one. Knowing that people were interested in seeing what was happening, he arranged to have a video projector set up that beamed an image from the camera feed onto a huge sheet-type screen hung on the side of a bank building located at one corner of Bartlett Square. And because this was a night scene, this setup worked to give interested people a way of watching the process. Now, the scene took several nights to complete because of a mechanism employed to accomplish the out-of-body effect used for the vision sequence. And working out issues with the effectiveness of that device meant a lot of time without anything interesting occurring in front of the camera for people to see. Now, that, in addition to the night turning into the wee hours of the morning, meant that the group of bystanders diminished and eventually evaporated. Well, one night, with nothing of interest happening on camera and hardly anyone to watch anyhow, Francis popped into the VCR his personal copy of The Adventures of Robin Hood and began projecting that onto the side of the bank building. So I found myself in the middle of the night watching a, 15 to 20 foot high Errol Flynn swashbuckling as I sat amidst an audience partially composed of downtown urban denizens, vagrants, winos, whatever. The other really memorable evening during that location shoot occurred on what I thought was Nick's birthday, Nick Coppola / Cage. But looking at IMDb, I see that his given birthday there is January. So if that's correct, then my memory is off on that. But I sure thought I remembered it as having been his birthday. Maybe it was someone else's birthday. Anyhow, Nick was on the set, even though he wasn't involved in the scene, and he got his hands on a portable video camera rig that Francis had. Nick began walking around with it, doing this kind of series of man-on-the-street type of interviews with members of the crew. They were really funny, and if they still exist, it's a shame that they haven't been included as an extra on a DVD or a Blu-ray release of the film. Speaking of birthdays, though, on Francis's birthday, the 4 Stars team of caterers providing food services on the picture did a skydive jump onto the location in his honor. Evidently, that was a hobby of theirs when they weren't working on movies. Incidentally, 4 Stars in this case, the first word is F-O-R, not F-O-U-R, so it's food 4 stars, as opposed to, hey, they're 4 stars rating, which in my book they were, if not 5. Now, as for the skydiving thing, I don't recall if that was the same day or night when they served up a luau menu complete with a large pit-roasted pig and Mai Tais, or if that was another date. They would do special themed meals from time to time. I remember another time, and maybe this was Francis's birthday, but in any case, they had a Mexican theme, and they went all out. They were wearing the sombreros as they were serving up the food, and they had hired a mariachi band. I think they had hung piñatas around the room where they were serving the meal that day, and it was fun. And I will tell you, I don't think I have ever eaten so well, so consistently as I did when I was working on that film. The food was just really outstanding. And although I never got to eat their food again, I did encounter them 5 years later when I first moved to the Los Angeles area and was able to visit the set of Walter Hill's Red Heat. 4 Stars was doing the catering for that film. And the hairstylist for Red Heat was Peter Tothpal, who had also worked on Rumblefish. I think he even gave me a haircut during the movie, but I'm not sure. Another birthday memory had to do with the movie's first AD, David Valdez. I remember showing up on the set wearing my souvenir Warner Brothers t-shirt that I'd purchased earlier that year when I toured the studio. As it happened, David arrived on the set that day wearing the same t-shirt, same color scheme and everything. When I saw him, I made some lame comment about my having heard that that day was his birthday, which it was, and so I decided to wear the same shirt in his honor. Completely stupid, I know. Anyway, fast forward a couple of weeks or so, I don't remember exactly how much time had passed, but I was getting dressed and thought, maybe I'd wear that shirt again. And I paused when I recalled what had happened the last time I'd worn it, but thought, oh, come on, what are the odds of that happening again? Well, pretty good, as it turned out, because sure enough, I arrived on the set and there was David once again wearing his own Warner Brothers logo shirt. As was I, but this time I made no sort of clever remark and we just went about our business. One of the most interesting things to me that I got to observe during the production took place as part of the rumble scene. The scene takes place under an old viaduct going over the railroad tracks on the north edge of downtown Tulsa. The area still had old bricks as its street surface, going back to the days before the viaduct was built, and you see those in the scene. One thing I recall about the time spent on that location is the one evening I met a visitor to the set who turned out to be the son of famed Japanese director Akira Kurosawa. At that point, I hadn't become the big Kurosawa fan that I would later. I think at that point I'd only seen Rashomon and Kagemusha, the latter of which Coppola had executive produced. Now, had I met Kurosawa's son in later years, after consuming many more of his father's films, I probably would have been even more impressed, and no doubt said something really stupid. Anyhow, at the end of the Rumble scene, which culminates in Matt Dillon beating the crap out of Glenn Withrow, Mickey Rourke makes his impressive entrance on a motorcycle.
What is this? Another glorious battle for the kingdom?
Hey, man, I thought you were gone for good.
I thought we had a treaty.
Distracted by his arrival, Matt doesn't see Glenn grab a piece of broken glass, and he gets badly slashed as a result. In response, Mickey guns his motorcycle, sending it shooting forward to hit Glenn, flipping them both. Though in reality, this couldn't happen, at least not as portrayed in the movie, it made for an impressive shot. Stunt legend Buddy Joe Hooker was the stunt coordinator on the film, and it was fascinating to see how this one was accomplished. A track was laid down, and the motorcycle attached to it. A concealed cable ran from the bike and around a corner where it was attached to the back of a truck. Buddy Joe's brother Hank, also an accomplished stuntman, was dressed as Glenn, and he stood on a pneumatically controlled hinged metal plate installed at the end of the track. When the cue was given, the truck drove forward, pulling the motorcycle rapidly along the track. When it hit the end of the track, the motorcycle flipped. Simultaneously, the metal plate that Hank was standing on was triggered, popping him up and sending him into an aerial backflip. Now, as the production wound down, evidently the budget had been sufficiently overrun that I was released before it wrapped. My last day of work consisted of overseeing the day-after cleanup of the Lake Community Clubhouse used for the party scene that involved Matt, Nick, Francis's older son, Gio, and some female friends. I did visit the set one more time, though, when another scene was scheduled that either was never completed or it was left on the cutting room floor. It involved a rooftop chase in which the actors had to jump across gaps between old apartment buildings that were located fairly close together. I didn't see those stunts executed, and that's why I'm not 100% sure if it was even filmed. After I'd completed my stint on Rumblefish, I went back to work at the restaurant and resumed playing Groucho. I'd later do other characters. For instance, I became their first Indiana Jones. After that, I created a Sha-Na-Na type of character called J.D. the Teen Angel, and I also began to DJ in the club part of the restaurant. Sometime later, I revived J.D. and did DJ work at an oldies club in town, and even got to sing a couple of numbers with the band when the Hollywood Argyles made a New Year's Eve appearance. As epilogue to my experience on Rumblefish, regarding my intent to apply to UCLA's film school, my having worked on the film paid off because I got a couple of letters of recommendation out of it, including one from Coppola himself, who is one of the school's most distinguished alums. However, for reasons I won't go into, I ended up not applying. I tried charting a different path with regard to a career in the movie industry, and though it didn't lead me where I'd hoped, the path I took still resulted in a lot of experiences and memories that I cherish, as well as this blessed life that I share with Debbie, so I have no regrets. As further epilogue, when I saw Rumblefish in its finished form, I felt that as interesting as it was to watch, and having been part of the production, I couldn't really be all that objective, I didn't think it did Susie Hinton's book justice. It seemed loaded with style, but kind of bereft of the soul of the story. Specifically with regard to the character of Steve, who in the book provided a perspective that really wasn't captured in the film. He was sort of the Greek chorus, you might say. Or for those of you who weren't theater majors, it was kind of the Jiminy Cricket, I suppose you would say. I mean, there was some of it portrayed in the film, but it was pretty incidental and really didn't color the story in the same way it did in the novel. A few years later, I bumped into Susie Hinton at a Safeway adjacent to the apartment complex that I was living in at the time. I didn't share my thoughts on the final product of Rumblefish with her. I don't know if they would have been well received or not, but I was content just to say hello, and it was nice to see her again. Well, that's the tale. I hope you found it at least somewhat interesting. For those of you who didn't switch over to Leonard Maltin somewhere along the way, thank you for listening and bearing with me. I promise you that I will have an interesting guest in place for episode 11. And so that you don't miss it, be sure to hit the subscribe or follow button wherever you listen, if you haven't done so already, and leave a rating or review if possible. Also, as always, I invite you to visit the Movie Nights and Matinees website, where you can leave a comment or peruse the other offerings there, including all of the past episodes. Be sure to swing by the Movie Nights and Matinees Facebook page. That's another place where you can let me know if you liked this episode, or if I should never do one like it again. You can even gang up on me with other listeners, should that be the consensus. I do value your opinion. Just be gentle.
Look, I'm okay, you're okay, okay?
No, you're not okay. Okay?
Okay.